we could have silence, please, and
How's that? So welcome back. Peter and I have been asked to just put a few questions, one at a time, to each of our speakers, and then hand it over to you. So Shane, Mark and Susan, thank you very much for your input. I think one of the heartening things is that most people who were there seem to have been somewhat uplifted by the experience, which, if you're like me, you'd think, how could you do all that deep listening to people who passionately disagree with each other about all sorts of things and emerge with some sense of equanimity, let alone joy and hope? So presumably the Holy Spirit is at work, and even commentators like my fellow Jesuits, James Martin and Tom Rees, were quite upbeat. But I did have a look the other night at the WAC Synod Symposium from Ireland, and it was pretty negative. So there's obviously going to be a lot of creative tension in the year ahead. So Shane, first question, I'm wondering, in terms of becoming a synodal church, Anglicans, they're fond of saying that they are episcopally led, but synodically governed. And if you look at the Anglican Church, both at a local level and at a supranational level, I mean, synods are very deeply embedded in their modes of governance, and they're able to make decisions at national levels which could never be made universally. If you think, for example, the issues of women's ordination or LGBT or whatever. So could you tell us, how do you think a universal Catholic synodal process is going to move us along in addressing those questions? And how is the, if you like, the one house synod of the Roman model going to do it, when you think that the Anglicans, when they make big decisions, they divide their synod into three houses: bishops, clergy and laity. And you need 2/3 vote of each of them, including laity. So how would you see the Roman model of synod working in the next year ahead to get us somewhere in those areas?
So I don't think I'd be starting from where the Anglicans are, and that's not where we're starting from. And it's one of the things that's been put to me a few times, is we don't want to end up like the Anglicans, or like the Luther, or like the this, or like the that. That's not what's on the table. And I think, in fact, and that's part of the point of the description of synods. Synods are not parliamentary. Parliamentary in the worst sense of parliamentary. Parliamentary in the sense of what you see at question time. An adversarial winners and losers thing. They do have some of the dimensions when we're operating synodally. It does have some of the dimensions that we see in Parliament at its best, where there's space for all views to be articulated and to be drawn together, and that wisdom included. Last thing to say about the Anglicans maybe is, I think that their structure has largely developed, at least in parallel with the development of the Westminster parliamentary system, if not being inspired by that, it's at least developed in parallel with that. That's not where we're starting from. Where we're starting from is, in fact, as Mark pointed to, a much closer parallel for us is the experience of religious in chapters, that sort of discernment thing. We're always going to have distinctive roles, particular roles. I mean, we're thinking out of the ecclesiology of Lumen Gentium, which is clear about distinctive roles for different parts of the people of God, but distinctive roles that are complementary and that can only do their bit if they're in a constructive and life-giving relationship with the other parts of it. One of the distinctions there comes around, I think one of the helpful distinctions to think about there is distinguishing between decision making and decision taking. And synods fit much more into the process of decision making, where there's reflection, consultation, discernment, gradual exploration, and moving towards a place where it's clear that this is the way forward. Then we need a process, a mechanism. So it's not so much that the decision making is more of the process, but we need a mechanism for actually formalising that decision, as the end of the process. Now, sometimes that'll be by a vote. So we had one set of votes in the session we've just had. It was on the last day. And it formalised what had already become clear. And when we do that next year, we will again have votes, but ultimately they don't count for anything. The one vote that counts is what the Pope does with it afterwards. Does that mean that our votes don't count at all? I don't think so at all. He's only able to do what he does because of the process that's led up to that. I think of the way that I would operate in drawing on the various consultative bodies that I've got, and that I couldn't do what I do without, where in many cases, eventually it's my decision on my own. But if I made that decision on my own without reference to any of those, they wouldn't always be great decisions, and B, they wouldn't land. They wouldn't land, and they wouldn't work. But that doesn't mean that it has to be decided by a vote on the floor. We can have a clear, a really helpful consideration where everyone has a part. So I'm thinking I'm wandering a bit away from the fairly clear question that you asked, Frank. But there was an issue that was floating around beforehand and became more pronounced as the synod went on, and in the final week became quite explicit on the floor of the synod that Mark pointed to around, is this still a synod of bishops? And if it's not a synod of bishops, well, what is it? And should we have a real synod after this? And so on, the various possibilities that were put forward. And there was a formal response to that by the Secretary General, Cardinal Gregg, which in fact the Secretariat, that it turned out, had been working on for a few weeks. Here's one we prepared earlier. And they don't do that sort of thing without working with the Pope in advance, which said very clearly, yes, the Pope is clear, this is still a synod of bishops. But a synod of bishops operates at its best when it is informed by and engaged with in a variety of ways in the whole consultation phase. So remember, the synod is a 3-year process. It's not the 2 meetings in Rome on their own. In the consultation phase, in the reflection, in the deliberating, the decision making, by the whole people of God, and is firmly rooted in and drawing its life from the whole people of God. So yes, it's a synod of bishops, but it operates at its best when that is enhanced by the concrete and real participation of the broader people of God.
I get my first question, and I want to make this brief. This is both to Mark and to Shane. You, Shane, spoke a lot about process, and people note the important process developments. You will have heard that some critics of the synod say the progressives won the process and the conservatives won the substance. I'd be grateful for comments from either of you or both of you on that issue.
Being on the commission that was responsible for the report in the end, I've got to wear that a bit. I can see something that could give rise to a comment like that, and that's that particularly with the timeline that we had to get a report to the floor that we were confident would get the votes that it needed. And I think we don't want to underestimate the significance of the wholehearted support for each paragraph of the report that we were able to secure. In the timeline that we had, and just to sort of fill that out a bit more, the second draft of the report was the first one that the Assembly saw. They saw that they received that on the Wednesday morning. We had interventions on the floor on the Wednesday afternoon. We had all day Thursday on our table groups to propose amendments. That closed at 7 p.m, 7:15, 7:30 or something, Thursday night. And by that time, there were over 1,100 amendments proposed by the tables and another 150 proposed by individuals. In the next 24 hours, in 5 languages, the theologians had to sift through all of those, work out on the basis of guidelines we'd given them, how to deal with those, and then present to us in the Commission by Friday night a third draft of the report, which really we couldn't do very much to because it had to go to the people, to the Assembly on the Saturday morning, so we could vote on Saturday afternoon. And particularly at that stage of the process, part of what happened in considering the amendments, reading the room, was to say to get this up with the strong support that we had. We need to avoid things that are going to annoy people, and so some of the sharper language was pulled back on, while trying not to dilute the content. Part of what that ends up, I don't think in the end that the content, like as I said, when you look at it closely, there is some really significant content in that report, but it doesn't jump out at you. And I think, and a lot of people would say that they recognise the voice of the Assembly in the report. It's faithful to that, but it doesn't reflect the voice of the Assembly in that it doesn't reflect the liveliness and the engageness of the dialogue and the lively and creative tension. There was tension. I don't think there was confrontation. There were confronting things said, but said respectfully, both on the floor and on tables. And you don't get some of that sense in the report. So in that sense, maybe, but I wouldn't put it quite that way.
Mark might like to comment on that.
Well, I'm not really. I wasn't there, inside that sort of debate. But
Did you watch Timothy Radcliffe and the story?
Oh yeah.
Somebody said, I don't know, I've got to talk about this and I don't know anything about it.
Yeah.
He said, that's never stopped you from talking.
Well, that's true. That's true of me too. Well, I mean, in answer to Frank's question, the first one, would be, I think there's been great progress not just in terms of the process, but in terms of the content. I mean, after all, people keep on saying the church is not a democracy, and we understand that, but it's not a dictatorship either, not even a benevolent dictatorship. So therefore, that movement, is there, it's moving. And the other thing is that why in my letters I quoted a lot of poetry, and one of the reasons why I did that was because in this sort of rationalistic way, I don't think you can ever get through these things rationalistically. The binary answer, either or. Many years ago, excuse my name dropping, when I organised Cardinal, brothers in my community always criticised me for name dropping, but when I organised Cardinal Martini to come out in 1996, we had a lot of discussions about these sorts of things, and one of the hot topics even then was this question of the role of women in ministry and ordination. And he said an interesting thing, which was very Jesuitical, but at one point he stopped and said, he said there are 3 things. He said, one is clearly the first principle is that under baptism, with baptism, men and women have equal dignity, and there must be, that's a fundamental principle of equality and under baptism in the church. So there's a principle. The second principle is that John Paul II has declared perhaps not infallibly, but he has declared definitively that he cannot see the way forward for the ordination of women. And he says you have these two principles, he said, which seem to be in contradiction. So therefore, he said, therefore it is certain that the Spirit will find a third way, a solution to resolve those two tensions, etc. Eventually, you know. Now, in my view, we shouldn't be looking for binary answers. We should be looking for the capacity for some sort of paradox, to live with paradox. That's not a very satisfactory answer for most process-orientated, rationalistic people, you know, who want everything, you know, to happen now. However, I think, in my view, the process did allow, you know, I mean, it seems to me, you know, one slight limitation of the process is that, you know, well, that's nothing against the Jesuits, Frank, but, you know, is that, you know, there are some, you know, sort of downsides to having a Jesuit as the Bishop of Rome, you know, because he runs the church as a spiritual director in a way, and it's consolations and desolations, and at the Amazon Synod, all of the cardinals and bishops there, and lay people who were there, not having to vote, but nonetheless they all agreed that, you know, that the viri privati, there would be the ordination of married men in the Amazon areas, an ecclesial conference now, which is another interesting development, you know, outside of that binary thing. And he, to everybody's surprise, said, no, the time is not right. Part of me said, well, you know, what happens if you die? You know, in the long run, we're all dead. You know, this might all end with you, etc. But on the other hand, you have to trust the Spirit. So I think the capacity for paradox, you know, both and, which is the Catholic analogical principle, is a very important thing to keep there, you know, and to live with the tensions, albeit, you know, with a certain amount of ordinary unhappiness.
Well, my last question is about diaconate for women, women's priestly ordination. So the proposal on women's diaconate states theological and pastoral research on the access of women to the diaconate should be continued, benefiting from consideration of the results of the commission especially established by the Holy Father. If possible, the results of this research should be presented to the next session of the Assembly. Well, what are we as church to do in the next year? Surely it would be a good thing to have the results of those two commissions available to us and for us all to participate in that discussion. And then on the question of women's priestly ordination, there's no mention of it, which presumably means no table or not a sufficient number of tables raised it. But the document does state the contribution of families of origin and the Christian community within which a young man's vocation is fostered, as well as that of other families that accompany his growth, cannot be underestimated. So it would seem to me that the underlying presumption of the document is that women's priestly ordination is just not on the table. Is that correct?
So I'll start with, not the easy one, but the clear one, yes. At this time, I think the judgment by people was that wasn't a live issue, that was able to be progressed at this time. And that would be true not just of people there, but that would be true also in the document for the continental stage and in the Instrumentum Laboris, which faithfully record the broad consultations. So the primary issue in relation to women's ordination that did come through in the consultation, and that was in the document for the continental stage and the Instrumentum Laboris and in the discussions, and is in the report, is in relation to the diaconate. We also had supporting that, just as we were about to begin, the publication of Pope Francis's response to the five dubia, which quoted the statement of John Paul around ordination of women as priests, though intriguingly said it was definitive, and none of us really know what definitive means, so we should perhaps have a look at definitive. That was very Jesuitical, shall we say. So the focus was on women potentially as deacons, and there was lots of discussion on that, and that is reflected. There's a paragraph that talks about the various views that were put forward there. Yes, it would be helpful if we had the Commission reports. It would be helpful if we had them years ago. We were mindful of being courteous and respectful. They're the Pope's reports, it's up to him. The Pope's Commission's Pope's reports, it's up to him what he does with them. So we were wanting to encourage him to make them available. And none of us are aware of his decision making and his considerations in terms of why he's done what he's done with them, and what might happen from here. In terms of what we do, and this is one of the things that isn't as clear as it might be in the report, there is a reference at the end of the part that talks about women as deacons to the permanent diaconate in general, which is over in a separate section. And this was one of the things where I think there was genuine movement and convergence on the floor, which emerged quite spontaneously and was a significant move, is that permanent diaconate has, in many parts of the world, and sometimes it varies diocese to diocese, but in many instances, shall we say, been experienced and as something which is sort of like a mini priest. You're on the way to being a priest. You do lots of things that are like what a priest does, but not all the things that are what a priest does. And you get married, which is not like what a priest does mostly. So you're preaching, you're associated with Mass and other liturgies and so on. The original experience of diaconate in the church was that its primary function was around service, a ministry of service, and that there was enormous value in re-engaging with that and reimagining what should we be thinking about permanent deacons as, especially in the context of that original charism of the call to service, which then has a liturgical element, but which is primarily a ministry of service. And that the thought about the consideration about who might be candidates for such a ministry should be considered in that context, rather than in the context where we are at the moment, where we often think about the diaconate as a stepping stone towards priesthood. So in terms of what we might be doing locally, I think there's enormous potential for thinking about the diaconate more broadly, and that, as the report says in other bits in the women's section and in the ministry section, what other sorts of ministries, ordained or not ordained, are helpful and appropriate for us at this time in the church.
And I think one of the recommendations in the report is this whole connection of what the proposal is saying and the further study in canon law that needs to be done, which presumably will be done by commissions that have been set up in this interim period as to what we develop. I mean, obviously I have a great respect for the priesthood and its centrality, but I am a brother, so I also sort of have this sort of feeling when I listen to the Amazon Synod and the sisters, mainly elderly sisters, giving their witness about what they did in the Amazonian region, where they baptised, buried people, offered effectively fraternal correction and confession, married people because they were given that right by the bishop, etc. And they did everything but, can celebrate the actual Eucharist, etc. And part of me as a brother, don't forget St. Francis of Assisi was not a priest and Benedict was not a priest, I don't get particularly worried about that. I think the naming of the experience will come eventually, but the experience is already there, that the priestly ministry of the people of God, is very rich. Obviously it has a sacramental character and that has to be worked out, more deeply. But the reality of the experience of people is also central too. And I'm sure if you talk to those elderly sisters who work in the Amazon and they were describing it, they wouldn't describe themselves as priests, but as far as I'm concerned, they are very much exercising priestly ministry, baptismal ministry, if you also want to use those terms. So I see hope that the name in the church, it's always centuries late. We're always like the Peter and John at the tomb. John arrives, the charismatic dimension gets there at the empty tomb in John's Gospel. Peter, representing the hierarchy of the church, gets there late and breathless, and is irrelevant, essentially by the time he gets there. And I think that may well be true. Sorry, nothing personal though.
Frank's foreshadowing his last question, so I've got to ask a sort of two-part question in a way. I think what a lot of us are really interested in knowing, people who work in the parishes, who work hard for the plenary council, were pleased but disappointed in various ways. What does this mean for us now, the Australian Church, now for the next 12 months, but beyond? What should we do? How can people here or elsewhere contribute to the circulatory stage? I see the Conference of Bishops had a meeting on the 12th of November, so perhaps you've considered this. So that's sort of part one. And part two is a different, longer-term question, but a lot of the things I've been struck with, and other people have been struck with, and you mentioned, and Mark is an expert in, is the extraordinary diversity of the church in regions around the issues they face. For example, we're told that polygamy is very prominent and well practiced among leading Catholics in Africa, but the churches are full, priests are coming forward a great way. They have very different problems to the ones we have. Is there a chance that we will, in the longer term, move towards perhaps Episcopal commissions, but I don't quite know what that is, but to greater delegation of major issues to local authorities?
Lots of questions there. I think it wasn't just two-parter.
That was my last.
Yeah. So again, I'll start with the ones where there's a straightforward, clear answer. There was a meeting on the 12th of November, which was at the end of the Bishops' Conference, which ran from the 9th, I think, from the Monday anyway, through to the Friday morning. And then on the Friday afternoon, there was a meeting as foreshadowed by the Plenary Council Implementation Plan of nominees from the Bishops' Conference, people nominated, by the Bishops' Conference, Catholic Religious Australia and the public juridic persons overseeing various church missionary agencies, mostly members of the Plenary Council. One was not from the AMPJP, but certainly very engaged, to give a preliminary report on the implementation of the Plenary Council, which has to be preliminary both because it's only a year and also because the decrees haven't yet got the recognition from Rome, so the decrees don't yet exist as decrees. But anyway, that met and the report has been prepared and is being laid out, and will be it's being published for Christ the King on Sunday. It's a 2-page report giving you an idea of that. One of the things that struck me in being part of that discussion was, and some of it is reflected in the report, is the number of things and different things that are happening in different parts of the church in Australia. Things that none of them satisfy all the people all the time, but there's synods, there's assemblies, there's gatherings, there's all sorts of groups. 10 years ago, there was almost none of this. So I think, yes, we're never where we'd like to be or where we're aiming to be, but we also need to acknowledge where we are. And it took me 3 years to go through a process in Sandhurst to work out what a pastoral council would best look like for that place, to engage the diocese in a process of reflection and preparation. So places take time, and different places are doing it with different sets of priorities and so on. But there is real movement. So the part of what I'd say in terms of what can you do locally is to support where you do see movement, and to prompt that there be movement. So one of the things in the Synod recommendations, even at this stage, is that pastoral councils be made mandatory for dioceses and for parishes, which is one of the things that we asked for for considering in the plenary council, and that many people have been asking for, because it gives it says this is the expectation, this is what should be happening, you should be working towards this. So that's good to work towards and to support. There are things that are clearly for reflecting. As I say, there are guides that are going to be prepared, but will take some time in terms of guiding the reflection of the people of God nationally. Exactly what that will look like, I'm not sure, but I think given the time frame, and also given the stage where, we're not in phase one, we're not at the stage of starting again. What do you think all around? We don't need all of this to be gathered and sent off to Rome to set the agenda. We've got the agenda. We've got all the material. They've got the stuff that they can be using to prepare the documents that we need for the next synod, for the next session. What we need locally, by which I'm thinking nationally, to my mind, is a process to engage with the people of God and inform the 10 members from Australia who are going back next year, so that we can be informed by the wider reflection of the people of God on the things that have been identified in the report. And there will be help for that. By all means, jump in, but I'd say don't take it all at once. You don't have to read it sequentially. They are 2-page sections. Take them as separate documents if you like. Reflect on them in your parish councils or whatever group you're part of. There's a lot that can be done there. There are various things in the convergences, as there are in the plenary council decrees, which are encouraging and asking all of us in all of the things that we're part of. So what are you part of that you might think about? Remember that first slide that I had up, the synodal conversion of the church. That doesn't just mean the synodal conversion of the bishops. What might all of it, although that wouldn't hurt, what might all of us do in the various things that we're part of to promote that participation in decision making, the real genuine listening to one another that is open to move into a different spot from, which is not just about so I can convince you that what I was saying earlier is actually right, but a real listening that's part of a dialogue that is trying to prayerfully discern where the Holy Spirit is calling us to. We can all do that in all sorts of contexts that we're part of. That hasn't answered all your questions, but that's probably okay. Not the first time we found that.
Just very quickly, I mean, as far as the regional things, I think the movement towards, in this pontificate, to the Pope stressing that local bishop conferences have a greater say in lots of things, is a welcome thing forward, because the trend, in John Paul II's pontificate was against, in the other direction of wanting to have greater centrality, although in some ways this is a very centralised papacy.
What's the Episcopal Conference in the Amazon?
Well, the interesting thing about the Amazonian Ecclesial Conference is that the Amazon Synod created, and the Pope has created, a constitution where there are these transnational, the several countries that constitute the Amazonian region have this Amazonian Ecclesial Conference, which has a totally new constitution, which is made up of bishops and priests, but also religious and lay people. So it's a new form of ecclesial structure which canon law is working its way through. As for whether the church should speak out on this or on that, etc., maybe sometimes it's best if the church doesn't say another thing for another couple of hundred years. For example, on sexuality, maybe. There are lots of documents, you know, we all know what the church thinks on most issues to do with sexuality, but Francis has said in interviews, and it's intimated in that document of the synthesis that, you know, that we should be much more attentive to a dialogue with the sciences, and then on that reflection, when we've really listened to what the sciences have to say, and I think that's mainly a reference to, about sexuality, but maybe climate as well, then we make a considered viewpoint. But it occurred to me to read this poem to you, briefly, which is from Emily Dixon's, because I think this is a perfect description of the synodal process. If I can you hold that, I'll just read it. It's one of my favourite poems. Tell the truth, tell all the truth, but tell it slant. Success in circuit lies, too bright for our infirm delight, the truth's superb surprise. As lightning to the children eased, with explanation kind, the truth must dazzle gradually, or every man be blind. And I think that's a significant step forward for the church, rather than Pius IX declaring, I am the tradition.
All right, let's throw it open to questions now. I think we should aim to finish at 7:15 so that we can have time to get together and have a discussion. So Jerry's going to hand the microphone to people.
The Pope has been reported as saying about this latest session of the Synod that it's a shame and a scandal that clericalism wasn't criticised enough and was supported by a substantial number of bishops. And he applied the same two words, a shame and a scandal, that a number of the bishops were quite happy to say that the laity should have a vote, but it shouldn't be as counted as strongly as the bishops' vote.
I haven't seen those reports, which doesn't mean that it hasn't happened. Clericalism was certainly criticised clearly in the report, while at the same time being careful, and this would reflect what was discussed on the floor, that it needs to be clear that criticising clericalism is not the same thing as criticising clergy. That clericalism is an attitude which is a misuse of authority and power, which, in the case of clericalism, by clergy, in a structure that can be set up and supported, in some instances by clergy, in some instances by others, and so on. So I was careful to try and do both of those. I didn't see or hear anything criticising that criticism, and certainly those paragraphs were some of the ones that got very high support.
Peter Johnson.
Just about that, the one little interesting thing that I heard, which in reference to obliquely to clericalisation, is that when the Pope got up to speak for the first time in the plenary sessions, etc., he raised the question of seminary formation, and he has made other remarks, including during the Synod. He made some comments about seminarians, interested in lace and this sort of thing, etc. So clearly he is very concerned about having a seminary formation that is disinclined to allow those tendencies to flourish. Okay, so I think that's a healthy sign, and I think that there would have been a lot of discussion about that, I'm sure.
Thanks, Peter Johnston. A quick remark first about synodal formation for bishops, Shane. I think it's greatly needed, and I think that's been shown throughout the church and shown in Australia today, and I make it a very serious comment. Diocesan pastoral council has been provided for in canon law since 1983, and there's only the exception of where diocesan circumstances are otherwise, and yet
the Archbishop of this diocese has made it quite clear he's had no intention of having a diocesan pastoral council. More importantly, Mark, I think you're a more patient man than me, but perhaps you're talking about the things that aren't as urgent in my mind. I'll be 107 when you turn 95. And there are things, I think we're losing some of what's driven this synod, but there are some very real problems in the church. We're not just sitting here academically talking about where the church should go next. We could talk about child sexual abuse particularly, and not only the abuse, but the shameful situation where our leaders of the church cover that up, not only in Australia but throughout the world. We could talk about the terrible treatment of LGBTIQA plus people. And can I say, I had the feeling earlier that the question of women's role in the church was being closed down. It's not closed down from my point of view. As far as I'm concerned, the equality of women in the church in ministry and in governance is extraordinarily important. That it's something that's been recognised in the rest of society for many years, and the church suffers at present because of the failure to include women properly. And that means, and ministry and governance, I'm not talking about women's ordination, we mightn't have priests in the future church if we change the structure suitably. That's by the by. Equality is the issue in both ministry and governance, and the church is losing a lot at present by not having that equality. And I was really pleased to have Peter ask that question as to where to from now. I'd hope that all the people of God who are the censors that know you will be having things to say. I just want to add something because, Frank, I actually read your last homily, which Mark was good enough to distribute in the Parramatta Diocese Outlook. And in that you pointed out that the Theological Commission of the Vatican many years ago indicated there was no theological objection to the ordination of women. I'm sorry if that was more a statement.
Did you have a question?
I don't need, in the spirit of synodality, it doesn't need to be a question.
Well, the only comment I'd make in response to that, or prompted by that comment, is that pretty well all the concerns that you stated you'll find in the synthesis report.
I've read it and I don't agree with you.
I could quote paragraphs, but that's not going to be helpful writing.
All right, question there.
Thank you, Francis Baker. I think this is a comment. I was reading through the document, getting quite excited, found lots of the things that you've indicated, Jane, and particularly in part 2, all disciples, all missionaries. And I think I'm just making the comment about how easy it is to upset people like me. So I'm a moral theologian and I work at the seminary, among other things. So we've got a chapter on women in life and mission of the church, a chapter on consecrated life, not a chapter, whatever they're called, a section. And then we come to 11, deacons and priests in a synodal church. And the opening line comes directly from Lumen Gentium, and it says, priests are the principal collaborators with the bishops. There's a document of Ecce Caritatis on consecrated life. It's not referenced. And there's a document and a chapter from Vatican II on the laity. The fact that the only one that's got a Vatican Council quote is the one about bishops, not bishops, priests being the principal collaborators. It might be true, but it doesn't need to be emphasised in my experience. Thank you.
Peter Wilkinson.
Peter Wilkinson. My question is about priestly formation. In the 6th decree, paragraph 5, it says new national...
Sorry, you're talking plenary council now?
Yeah, plenary council, yeah, the 6th decree. New national guidelines for seminary formation have been approved by the Australian Catholic Bishops' Conference, are in the final stages of being confirmed by the Holy See. First question is, have they been confirmed?
No.
Thank you. And the second question is, there are 4 proposals, I think, about priestly formation in the report from the first session. Would the guidelines that the Australian bishops have prepared be upgraded if those proposals from the Synod were carried?
Yes, because if they were progressed, then you'd end up with a new international document, the Ratio Fundamentalis, which is the basis for the Ratio Nationalis, the national document. So yes.
Constant views?
Just coming back to what Peter was saying, I'm not really very patient, but I use the example of Helder Kamara, who did great things, but then he was removed. He was replaced by a bishop who then did everything the opposite of what he had done in Recife. Yet we've lived to see, admittedly it takes a long time, very frustrating, but the Spirit wins through, and that you have essentially the election of the Latin American Pope, who was the gift of the Spirit, admittedly 30 or 40 years later, after great suffering of the Church in Latin America, where the fruits of his experience, and Helder Kamara's experience, do win through. So I don't necessarily feel emotionally very patient, but at another level, I have hope, because I can see there are, in my view, this whole thing, the election of Francis and his ministry is a miracle.
Constant?
Thank you, Constant Muse here. This is a question for Shane on a very practical point. Given the evident limitations of that huge document, is there still, I'm really asking about the way forward that we can go. Is it still going to be, is there enough material meat to chew on to make that a sort of a focus for continuing reflection? What would be the next useful stage for us, in those various church communities around, that we can move forward? Is it going to be of advantage to reflect or make a potted digest of the meatiest bits in that document?
So thanks, Constant. That's really helpful. Yes, there's plenty of meat. I think it takes a fairly strong carnivore to persist with it at this point. Like there's no fluff, but there's some things that are more useful to be picking up here now than others. So I certainly wouldn't want to discourage anyone from doing that, but at the same time I understand people who might like to wait for a guide to assist that. What we may end up with is something like what we've got for the Plenary Council, where we've got that study guide for the decrees, which takes you through each of the decrees and says, this is a boiled down version of the theological introduction, and then in your local space, this is how you might be acting on it now. So think about these questions in your local space. So for people who are keen, go for it, get into it. I expect that there will be some assistance in terms of complementary materials to help that. But for everyday groups, I'd be encouraging probably as more accessible that study guide to the Plenary Council decrees, because there's plenty in those that we haven't implemented yet.
Could you give us your name, please?
Yes, Robert Carey. It's kind of responding a little bit from what's Constance saying about meat, and also reflecting on Austin Ivory's concern about polarisation in the church. A senior Catholic leader in Australia in the last few days has written about the council and said that it was the most theologically light council ever. And I think he also said that while there are some lovely things about the process, surely they're going to have to do it differently next time. So did you think that the synod was lightweight theologically, and will they do it differently next time?
I'm never going to suggest that all rushes are lightweight, or many of the, there was a very substantial theological input into each of the modules, introduction into each of the modules, and there's a substantial theological element in the instrumentum laboris that introduces the worksheets. The discussions on the tables inevitably were ones which drew on people's prayerful discernment in response to all of that. And the people around the tables were, for the most part, not theologians, including the bishops. And so they were contributing what they were bringing. And it's important too to remember that this is the first part of a two-part assembly, in a longer 3-year process. And a bit like in the plenary council, this first stage is this first session, or this first assembly, is something of a clearinghouse. Identifying where out of all of the vast range of things that came up during the consultations, where should we be putting our energy? Where should we be putting our reflection? What direction should we be going in that? When we come to the next assembly, that does need to be different, because the task is different. The task then is coming to a point where we have clear resolutions and recommendations that we can put to the Pope. I'd anticipate that there will be substantive proposals, something like there were for the plenary council, where we had draft decrees to work with for the second assembly, which arose out of doing work with theologians on the material and the reflections that arose in the first assembly. So I'd anticipate that there would be a different sort of document that we would be working with, and a different aim to our discussions. That doesn't mean that you're necessarily going to have different tools that you use. There was the last day, the Friday morning, we spent the morning talking about what do we do from here and what do we do at the next session. And there was universal support for an affirmation of the importance of the format of the round tables, and particularly the method of conversations in the Spirit. Now, you can use them in all sorts of ways. At the second assembly of the plenary council, we used them very differently from how we did in the first assembly. So you can use those same critical tools which have been valued so much, and place explicitly your decision making in the context of as part of a process of prayerful discernment, while using it for a different goal, if you're clear about where it is that you're heading. So yes, I think there will be a different character, but in terms of the photos will look the same, and the tools that we're using will be very much the same. And there was not only support voiced on the floor, but the voting for the paragraphs that talk about the value of all of those methods were very high also.
I just want to comment that I've asked Bishop Shane if it's possible to access Orm Rush's intervention, and he's going to send me the reference, and I'll circulate it by email.
The other thing I would say about that, one should not discount as insignificant the appointment of Francis in the last few months of a new prefect for the Congregation for the Doctrine of Faith, Fernandez, the Argentinian, his personal theologian who was instrumental in writing lots of his apostolic exhortations, Evangelicarium and many others, and has shown a definitive tendency towards acting boldly. For example, he responded to the Dubia extremely quickly. When they didn't publish the Pope's response, he came out and published them that afternoon. And he has shown a capacity to be involved in the theological arguments, even on something as controversial, in inverted commas, as same-sex blessings. The Pope, before the synod began, with Fernandez, sort of actually said, well, really, there's no theological problem with that. How it works out in local Episcopal conferences may be, vary from very. So I think he is a very interesting figure that you would have to say he's a very different man from Cardinal Mueller, who was there, you know, in a slightly different capacity during the Synod. But his role, I would say, is important.
I think we'll take 2 more questions.
Stephen Rigo. My question is with regard to polarisation and the people who are more unhappy and melancholic than you and I, who would love to be beatifically enjoy back in 1950. There was an article that I read the other day speaking about how clergy and laity who come from very different positions of understanding of what the church should be should use the example of the synod to talk to one another. And maybe we as priests in our own dioceses and together with laity, do you foresee the possibility of getting together those who are polarisers and currently just seem to be doing more harm than anything else? And it concerns me what you say, Mark, that they may well be the leaders in the future because of the internet rather than the Bishop of Rome.
I don't think I could envisage having advertising a forum for polarisers or a forum for the disgruntled or whatever. I think it's very healthy to continue having forums for all of the people of God and encourage and have them constructed in have them shaped in such a way that there's scope for people who we disagree with to voice tensions in a respectful, constructive way. So if people feel that something is set up in a way that they're not going to be heard or they're going to be shouted down or whatever, well, why would you bother? I mean, that just encourages polarisation. So we need to be careful in the way that we set things up, that it is not that we don't just say that it's inclusive and welcoming, but that we structure it in a way that people can actually be heard. And something like the Conversations in the Spirit methodology can be a really useful way of doing that, of moving out of an adversarial mode. Because in the adversarial mode, none of us get anywhere, none of us learn anything. We all just dig deeper and deeper into our trenches. So it's about bringing people together in all sorts of contexts, all sorts of forums, in a way where there is space for that to happen. And I'd say, in fact, Mark talked about the confidentiality in the hall. I was pushing for looser rules at the start, but in the end I think the rules worked, partly because they were enforced in a very Italian way, but they did have the effect of really moderating the way that people engaged with conversation outside the hall, so that there was no sense that we had silent, well, or not so silent, conversation partners who weren't sitting at the tables. The people we were talking to were sitting there in the hall with us, and were needing to and were generally very happily putting their views, not all agreeing with one another at all, in respectful ways in the hall. And it was a really healthy, life-giving tension, I'd say.
All right, question at the back there.
I'm Wendy Prendergast, a single mother, but love my church. And this is more a statement. We talked about Catholicism being at a crossroad. I had time 2.5 hours to get here today on a tram. We have left a couple of generations behind, when only a few of the lay people haven't heard of synodality, let alone our youth. This is now a statement. After 80 years plus, I loved my church, my husband and I. We loved the liturgy, our children loved it. They taught in Catholic schools. We were part of the Vatican Council. This is all back in Hobart days. And 69, the liturgy conference. It was exciting times for us. Now, some schools, churches are too comfortable and not challenged with growing and leaving generations behind. We've left 2 generations behind, I feel. what are we going to do about those two generations?
I'll take that mostly as a comment, and it's certainly not the first time any of us have had that thought or heard that question. But the one thing I think is worth saying is synodality is not the point as a word. Who cares about the word? Who cares about who has heard of the word or quotes it or can put it in the crossword or on the Scrabble board? You don't have to know the word to be able to act synodally, to be able to act in a way that builds up communion, that renews our mission and encourages people to participate. We can all do that without ever using the word.
And I'd come back to that word revelation, you know. I mean, it may be true that other generations, newer generations, may be practicing the faith, in inverted commas, in different ways than previous generations. Culturally, we're not the same. St Gabriel's Reservoir, where I came from, was a very different world 55 years ago than what it is now for young people who live in that area. However, the Spirit is still at work, you know. That's the given, you know, and revelation is ongoing, and therefore I have confidence that young people, if they're encouraged and accompanied, will find new ways and new expressions. So I'm not, and you know, in Melbourne, the Melbourne Archdiocese, over its history, its old history, you know, has always been a place where there have been creative priests and creative pastors and creative movements and RE teachers and sort of things who've actually tried to bridge that gap between faith and culture. That will continue, you know, and I think the given thing is to have faith in the fact that the Spirit is always still being poured forth. Yeah. It may not feel like it, I admit.
Look, I think on that point we'll conclude this evening or conclude the formal part of the evening and give you an opportunity to talk amongst yourself. I'd like to finish up by thanking Newman College and Father Frank Brennan in particular for the support he's given us. We've been very fortunate in being able to have several meetings here where we think it's been very important opportunity to get these issues discussed. And I'd like to just say that in the next year we're very keen to see how we can contribute to an ongoing discussion in the lead up to the final session of the Universal Synod. And if anyone's interested in seeking more information and offering support, then we're very happy to receive it. So I think at this point, I think if we could give a round of applause to our speakers. Thank you.
It's hard to know what to get as a matter of appreciation for these two very distinguished gentlemen who've made massive contributions to the Australian Church. My experience has been that for bishops, priests or religious, red wine is a pretty good format. Where we get a bottle of red wine good enough for these two, we don't know. We don't have access to the Jesuit cellars, unfortunately. But we did manage, I hope, to find something and that they enjoy it. As Richard said, SOF is an organisation of a few old men, really, and we badly need help from some younger women. And that I noticed when I got up to give them is that there are gift cards associated with this, but of course nothing's been filled in on. Thank you very much.
Look, I'd strongly encourage you to get a drink and to move out onto the parapet, which is now open, and a good opportunity to get out into the open air. Thank you.